Welcome to this seminar. Welcome everybody across the world from wherever you are. Thank you so very much for being with us today. Our discussion today is about cryptocurrency, blockchain, and the re-engineering of ownership. We're doing two things today. We are launching a research group for the IFK at the University of Johannesburg. And then we're having a seminar which is going to be led by Professor Steven Sidley, which is crypto, blockchain, and the re-engineering of ownership. That's what we're doing today. So two things, launching a research group and then having a seminar as an act of launching this group. How is our event structured? Our presenter is Professor Steven Sidley, who is head of research in terms of the blockchain and Cryptoverse Research Group at IFK. And our discussant is Professor Charles Halley. And then after those two, we're going to have participation by our audience. You must raise your hand. There's a function to raise hands in Zoom, or you can put a message in the chat room. And then we have our closing remarks from Professor Ngulu. So this is the structure of our discussion. I'll say a bit more about these individuals as I call them to speak. But this is our mandate today, to have a public lecture from Professor Steven Sidley and launch a research group in this field at the IFK at the University of Johannesburg. Now, what do we mean by blockchain? Blockchain is a shared and immutable ledger that facilitates the process of recording transactions, tracking assets, and building trust in a business network. What do we mean by an asset? An asset can be tangible, a house, a car, cash, or land, or intangible, intellectual property, patents, copyrights, or branding. So a blockchain is a chain of blocks that contain information. The data which is stored inside a block depends on the type of blockchain. The first block in a chain is called the Genesis block. So in summary, a blockchain is a storage technology used for saving data or storing different types of information in a decentralized network. It provides a way to securely, efficiently store information in a manner that is tamper-proof and also facilitating sensitivity of information. So security, efficiency, and tamper-proof. Those are the characteristics of a blockchain. In terms of a diagram, we have data in a block and a reference. So a blockchain becomes a growing list of data blocks that are linked together as shown in the diagram. So it permits transactions to be gathered into blocks and recorded. It allows the resulting ledger to be accessed by different users. And of course, there's cryptology involved for security of the information. And Steve will talk about that in detail. So this is how a ledger might work. Users might initiate transactions using digital signatures. Users broadcast their transactions to nodes. One or more nodes begin to validate the transaction, and nodes are validated through transactions, and nodes broadcast blocks to each other. Consensus protocol is used. A block reflecting true state is chained to a prior block. This is a way in which the ledger might work. And what is cryptocurrency? Cryptocurrency is a digital currency designed to work as a medium of exchange through a computer network that is not reliant on a central authority. Away with the bank, away with the government, away with the central bank, we're having a decentralized financial system. It is a medium of exchange like the US dollar. All cryptocurrencies have monetary value. Cryptography is the study of secure communication techniques that only allow the sender and the intended recipient of a message to view the contents. So we're emphasizing crypto meaning concealed, secret, secure, protected. That is the basis of cryptocurrencies, a digital currency designed to work as a medium of exchange through a computer and not reliant on a central bank, a government, or on a central authority. That's what we mean by cryptocurrency. And where could we have cryptography in this? Digital signatures, private and public keys, proof of work, and certain alternatives in the hash function. This is how cryptography can be used within the blockchain. What is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is an example of cryptocurrency. It is an application of blockchain. So in other words, blockchain is a bigger field, and you have Bitcoin as an element or as an application of blockchain. A decentralized digital currency that can be transferred on a peer-to-peer Bitcoin network. Bitcoin transactions are verified by network nodes through cryptography and recorded in a public distributed ledger called a blockchain. So let us understand the link between blockchain and Bitcoin. A Bitcoin block in a blockchain contains information about the sender, receiver, and the number of Bitcoins that are transferred. This is the link between Bitcoin and blockchain. And the history, the idea was mooted in 2008, in the Bitcoin network 2009, 2010, and by 2011, one Bitcoin was equal to $1 US. 2013, $100. 2014, Microsoft accepts Bitcoin as a means of payment. 2017, one Bitcoin equals 10,000 US. Today, as of this afternoon, one Bitcoin is worth 20,572. And of course, in the last 2 weeks, there was volatility in the market around Bitcoin, and it lost 15% of its value. And Sidley, Professor Sidley will tell us what is going on in the market with respect to Bitcoin. But that's the history of Bitcoin so far. So emphasis, Bitcoin is not equal to blockchain. It is an application of blockchain. And blockchain is a much wider system. Bitcoin ecosystem is a network in which anyone, including malicious participants, can play a role. Even though it is not organized by a central bank, it works. Why do we care? Why are we setting up a group at UJ? Why are we bothering with this field? Blockchain will change every industry. No industry will be left unchanged by blockchain. Examples, cross-border payments, efficient trade facilitation, supply chain logistics, distributed storage, Internet of Things, secure sharing of medical records, decentralized voting for those countries where there's rigging of elections. You can use blockchain to secure the vote. Royalties tracking, musical royalties tracking. So blockchain technology is going to affect and revolutionize every industry with security, privacy, and efficiency. Cryptocurrency are challenging traditional banking, traditional finance by leading us to decentralized financing, where there's no need for a central bank, where there's disintermediation of the banks, cutting the banks out of the equation. This is a revolution. And as such, we feel as IFK that we must have a group that is dedicated to studying blockchain, dedicated to studying cryptocurrency, dedicated to studying the revolution around Bitcoin. This is why we are setting up a research group at IFK. And what is going on? Bitcoin is now legal tender in the Central African Republic, legal tender in El Salvador. It is legal in the US, in the European Union, Denmark, France, Germany, Iceland, Japan, Mexico, Spain, and United Kingdom, to name a few countries. Of course, other countries have an explicit ban on Bitcoin. What is going on? Stephen will explain to us what is going on around Bitcoin as legal tender. Recent volatility, as I've said, it has lost 15% of its value in the last few weeks. What is going on? Hopefully this seminar will answer those questions. This is why we are saying, let us set up a group, the blockchain and the Cryptoverse Research Group at IFK. The research head is Professor Steven Sidley, who is going to be presenting today. And the group will be a pinnacle of excellence, championing research, events, and activities around blockchain and Cryptoverse. This is the background to our seminar today. This is the background to our work today. Our speaker today, our public lecture, is from Professor Steven Sidley. He's professor of practice at the Johannesburg Business School here in Johannesburg. He's a partner at Bridge Capital and will be head of the IFK Blockchain and the Cryptoverse Research Group. He's co-author of a very interesting book called Decentralized Finance and the End of Banks. You must look out for that book. Very interesting stuff in there. He was educated at the University of Witwatersrand and also University of California in Los Angeles. This is our seminar today, Crypto, Blockchain, and the Reengineering of Ownership. Professor Steven Sidley, the moment is yours. So Professor is going to take us through a lecture, and then there'll be a discussant after that. This is our activity today. Professor Steven Sidley, the moment is yours.
First of all, thank you to Professor Butambara for those opening words, and also to you, Professor, and Professor Harley and Professor Casaboni for all having a hand in inviting me to help build and lead the crypto and blockchain research unit at IFK. And thank you to Professor Carolson for inviting me, appointing me as Professor of Practice at the Johannesburg School of Business. Right, with those preliminaries, let's get started. I'm going to take an extremely fast skate along the surface of what has become a very, very deep ocean in the short period of only 13 years. And those of you who are perhaps students out there viewing this thing, wondering on what you should be studying as you go forward in your academic career, you will notice as I go through this, there will be scores of potential master's theses and PhD dissertations buried in some of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about. Almost every slide that I cover is an entire course worth of investigation. So I'm going to try and do it thin, but I'm going to be as broad and articulate as possible so you can walk away from this lecture with the whole field in your heads. I'm going to start off with a story about a general and his field commander, and I want you to keep the story in your heads because I'm going to come back to it. Consider thousands of years ago, before there was electronic communication, there is a general at his home city somewhere, and he's at war, and he has an army out there. And he gets a message from a horseman who comes running back, riding a full day, saying, "We're losing this war." The general says, "Why are we losing? Tell me about the topology of the land." And the guy says, "There's a river and there's a bridge and the other side, and they're coming over the bridge, and there's a forest to the left, and we're getting killed." The general thinks about it and he says, "I know exactly what to do. We've got to do a 3-pincer movement, and we want some people to go south and go down the further bridge over there, go around the forest at the top, and we'll win." And he writes this down on a piece of paper and he gives it to the horseman, the messenger, and the messenger gallops off to give it to the field commander. And before the messenger gets there, he gets captured, and they find the general's instructions and take it back to the other side, and our general's army loses the war. What actually happened there? The general had written something that was a secret. He wanted this to be secret, and he wanted to share the secret with his field commander. Had he been able to do that, he would have won the war. Because the guy gets captured and the thing gets stolen, the secret is gone. Keep that in mind, I'm coming back to it. That secret is something that the general owned. So what does it mean to own something? Even a child understands what it means to own something. When you own something, it is yours. You can share it, you can sell it, you can give it away, but you can do all those things because it is owned by you. This is understood to a child, and it has been dispersed into our civilization, largely by means of things called deeds of possession. I'm going to give you an example of 3 deeds of possession. Deed of possession, you go to the internet connection and you buy yourself a Macintosh, they give you a receipt. That is a deed of possession. Your insurance company will want that receipt in order to insure that computer. You buy a car, you get a registration certificate, that's a deed of possession. You buy a house, you get a title deed, that's a deed of possession. And that deed of possession is either lodged in your drawer, sometimes it's lodged at the city, sometimes it's lodged at the traffic department. They are inflexible formats, but I want you to keep in mind that in our civilization, we have these deeds of possessions. Almost all of the crime in our society are crimes against ownership. If you steal something that is owned by somebody else. If you commit fraud, you steal money that does not belong to you. Even in the worst of cases, if you take a life, you're taking something that doesn't belong to you. Most of the crime in our society are crimes against some form of ownership. The lecture today is going to look at the whole of crypto, the whole universe, through this lens of ownership, which is why I'm spending time in the first slide. By the way, I just have to keep my eye on the time, 7:16. I'm going to finish hopefully at about 1:45. So what we have done as a society is, because we're scared of theft and fraud, we often, in many cases, give those deeds of possession to custodians to keep on our behalf. And they're custodians that we trust. They are banks, they are middlemen, they are lawyers, they are also other sort of trustees, and we pay them rent to keep this ownership safe for us. We trust those people. We trust those people either because they have a brand, or because they have a legacy of being trustworthy, or because we pay for that trust and we know that when they receive the money, they don't want to lose our business, so they're going to keep that trust. But there is a difference between trust and trustlessness, and you will hear the word trustlessness applied to crypto very often. The difference between something that you trust and something that you don't. You trust your bank because it's been in business for a couple of 100 years and it's never lost anybody's money, even though they might be quite annoying sometimes. But you do not have to trust the equation 2 + 2 = 4. That is what is meant by trustless. Trust does not come into the equation in a trustless environment. And we're going to see how the whole of crypto does not need to be trusted because it is like mathematics. It does not require trust. It is a trustless technology. Okay, let's go back to our general. So our general has a better idea next time around, another war, and he wants to send a message to his field commander, and what he does is he has a wonderful idea, and he changes every letter in his message. He moves A's to B's and B's to C's and C's to D's so that the letter looks like garbage if it's stolen. And his horseman goes off to deliver the message to the field commander, and he gets captured, and the guy reads the message, and it's just a scramble. The guy says, "What is this?" The horseman says, "I don't know." And the guy says, "Well, I'm going to hit you upside the head if you don't tell me what this is." And because the horseman's scared, he said, "Well, you know what the general actually did is he moved A's to B's and B's to C's and C's to D's. That is called a cipher. That is the mechanism, the algorithm, which turns something that was intelligible into not intelligible. It doesn't work very well because you can crack a symmetric key by being very clever. You can crack a symmetric key by threatening to hit somebody upside the head. They work reasonably well, but they have weaknesses." In the 1970s, there were a couple of researchers who were thinking about this problem. Is how do I share a secret with somebody where I don't have to share the key, where the person who locks it doesn't have to have the same key to unlock it? And they noticed that there was a certain class of mathematical functions called trapdoor functions. Now, for those of you who have done any maths at all, even at high school, will remember a very simple equation, y = x squared. It's a kind of a graph that goes up like that. If you know what y is, let's say y is 2, then the result on the other side of the equal sign is 4. If you know what x squared is, let's say it's 9, you know the result on the other side is 3. It is equally difficult to calculate that way and that way. With the trapdoor function, it is very easy to go one way and functionally impossible to go the other way. It was a mathematical oddity. It is a mathematical oddity. And these crypto researchers realized that if they could harness the power of this trapdoor function, they could build a system in which you didn't have to share a key to share a secret. And what resulted out of that was a thing called the public-private key pair. When you open up your internet browser and you see at the top HTTPS, your data coming to and from that website is protected by a public and private key pair. I'm not going to go into the details of it. They're fairly arcane, but it was the shaft of light that suddenly shone on this technology, which ended up with the blockchain, and we'll get there. So moving on. The original sin. Does anybody know why there was no money on the internet in 1995 when the internet started appearing in the public. The reason there was no money built into the internet is this was a government project. And the United States government, in fact, it was a defense agency project originally, said this is not for commercial use. This is a research project and nobody may put money in there. Nobody may build a mechanism into the internet to transact with money. So nobody bothered to do it. But by the time the internet became public, there were other things that started to get built into the internet. I'll give you a whole bunch of them because we all know them. A JPEG file, it was a format for carrying pictures, or a PNG file. Voice over IP, video streaming, all of those things were built natively into the internet. Oh, HTTPS, that very word, which allows you to link things across the internet. They were built natively into this piece of technology called the internet, but nobody could understand and work out how to natively build in money into the internet. And that was the problem with a whole bunch of researchers from the 70s and all the way through the 90s and into the 2000s were wrestling with. So before I tell you how they solved that problem, I want to tell you what money is traditionally. During the research on this book that we wrote, we went to an enormous amount of research going back thousands of years, looking at different representations of money. Money has to be durable, can't have money rotting. Money has to be divisible. If it's not divisible, then you can't buy cheap things. Money has to be recognizable as money, otherwise you could just use anything. And in fact, the word sound money comes from the sound that a gold coin makes when you drop it on cobblestone street in Rome. It made a particular sound that made it recognizable as gold. Money has to be portable. Gold bars are not portable. Cattle are not portable. Iron bars are not portable. Money has to be non-counterfeitable. If it's counterfeitable, it's useless. The beginning of the slave trade in Africa to Europe was because there were some tribes in Central Africa who were using glass beads for trade. And colonialists came, they saw that, they went back to Europe, they manufactured a whole bunch of glass beads, they came back, they used the glass bead, debased the currency, and people had to sell people, and the slave trade started. Money has to be fungible. What fungible means is your rand and my rand are completely interchangeable. If you give me a rand and I give you a rand, they still buy the same thing. And money has to be scarce. That is the most important one. If it is not scarce, it has no value. The reason why gold has value is it's difficult to find and it's difficult to mine. And I'm going to come back to the scarcity issue. Going to end off here saying, who owns your money? You think that the rand in your pocket is owned by you, or the dollar in your pocket if you're in America. It is not owned by you. It is owned by your government. And at your government's discretion, they can debase that currency, they can devalue that currency, and they can take it away. As happened in Cyprus in the early 2000s. They closed the banks, they took the money away. They were insolvent. They took the retailers' money. Do not ever believe that the money in your pocket belongs to you. It does not. It belongs to the central bank of your country, which takes us now to the original gangster, as described by Professor Mutambara, Bitcoin. So Bitcoin arises out of a paper that was written by a pseudonymous author by the name of Satoshi. We don't know who he was. We do think it was a he because there were some later emails that refer to him. And Satoshi wrote a paper which was best word to say was a consolidation of all this research that had started with this trapdoor function. And he solved a whole bunch of problems which had been wrestled with all this researcher to build something native to the internet, which could be used to transact securely. Each one of these is a big subject. It was decentralized, meaning two things. It means, number one, that there was no corporation that you could go sue or that a government could shut down if they didn't like it. It belongs on individual citizens of different countries' computers. It is decentralized. It can't be stopped. There's no corporation. There's no limited liability company. There's no partnership. It just exists on people's computers. More important, the decentralization allowed many, many, many people in their computers to verify a transaction. And importantly, many anonymous people. The best sort of consensus is when thousands of strangers put up their hand and say, we all saw the same thing. Much better than if thousands of friends stand up and say, we all saw the same things, because you can get collusion between friends. You can't get collusion between strangers. So the decentralization gave the security of knowing that if a transaction was approved by the majority of these anonymous people, it was a real transaction. It is immutable, meaning it can't be changed. Once a transaction has been confirmed, transaction like I send some Bitcoin to you, it can't be rewound. It is locked in by cryptography. The single most important problem that was solved was the solution to the double spend problem. What is the double spend problem? You remember the days of checks. You could send a check to two different people, even if you didn't have money to cover it, and they thought they would have the money, and then that check would bounce. What happens at your bank when you pay somebody is you say to, Bob says to Alice, I'm going to send you money through my bank. And you say to the bank, please take 100 Rand out of my account and send it to Alice. The bank first checks that you have money in your account. Then they take that money, they change the ledger at the bank, and they send it off to Alice. You can't double spend. The bank takes the role of the anti-double spender. They were able to solve this problem with mathematics so that there was nobody in the middle, and you could send a transaction from one person to the other with no chance of there being a double spend risk. It was a critical problem. 30 years were spent solving this. Scarcity is the other important one. I mentioned earlier that all other currencies are distributed by, manufactured, minted by governments and central banks. And they tell you that it is scarce because they don't want you to think that they can print money forever, but they do. In the research for this book, we found out that over 6,000 years, every single nation state that has gone bankrupt because it debased its money. This nation state wants to invade that nation state. They don't have enough money to do it, so they print more gold, or they salt the gold coins with silver. This guy wants to build a big palace, so he prints more money. 70% of dollars in existence today were printed in the last 2 years. That is why there's inflation. What happens when you print money is that the value of the money gets debased because there's more now. And you have the following scenarios. You have the scenario I just told you about dollars. You have the scenario if you're an Argentinian, 40% of your wealth has disappeared in the last 10 years. If you're in Turkey, 60% of your wealth has disappeared in the last 15 years. If you're South African, in the last 20 years, the value of the rand has halved. This is all because of government spend or government mismanagement or economic systems that don't particularly work well compared to others. Bitcoin solved this problem by saying we are printing 21 million Bitcoins and no more will ever be printed. It is a deflationary asset. It cannot inflate. There is no government to inflate it. There's no maths that inflate it. There is no corporation. There are no programmers who can inflate it. It is locked into the mathematical algorithm. You've heard Professor Mutambara talk about permissionlessness. Anybody can join this thing. This has enormous impact on financial inclusion, for instance. There are people who cannot join banks because they don't have enough money, because they don't have an ID, because they don't have a driver's license, because they don't have a birth certificate. None of that applies in the blockchain. Anybody can join. I won't go into the last two because I can see that I'm pushing my time limits already. I'm going to move. Sovereign individual. There was a movement called the sovereign citizen in the 1990s that caused a whole bunch of trouble in America because these were citizens who didn't want to be governed. It has been replaced by the sovereign individual. And there's a series of social science questions, not technological questions, for those of you who are social scientists, who look to what do you own? What do you really own? If you have a piece of furniture, an old piece of furniture in your lounge, how do you know you own that couch? How do you know you own that table? You don't have a receipt for it. It's been in your family for 2 generations. You only know that because other people know that you own it. And you can call in 50 of your friends and they'll all say, yeah, I own that. So if the thing gets stolen and you find the person who stole it and he says, no, you never owned that, I own this. You can get 50 of your friends, bring the police in, the 50 friends will say this is his. What are you entitled to own is an entirely different question. Are you entitled to own land? Yes, but not in all countries. Are you entitled to own your money? You think you are, you're told you are, but you're not. In no nation state are you entitled to own your own money. Who is entitled to take it away? Most importantly, how do you know that you own yourself, your identity? And there is a large number of initiatives in the blockchain to prove your digital identity. Your birth certificate doesn't prove your digital identity, it's a piece of paper. Your photograph doesn't prove it. Face has changed, you can get hurt, you can be in a fire. Your fingerprints don't prove it. You can cut your finger with a knife, your fingerprint will no longer work on that machine. How do you know you are you? What is your digital identity? It turns out that your digital identity is a conglomeration of your entire past, your mother, your father, your friends, your business relationships, your social friends, your experiences. If you put all of that stuff together, along with the documents you've been given by your government, that is your identity. And those blockchain initiatives are building those nets and social circle to create blockchain identities. Let me just leave it there and move ahead. What happened? 2009, the blockchain. There's a kid, 2010, who's watching this. His name is Vitalik Buterin. There he is. He was on Time magazine. He proudly displays his nerdiness. When I first saw this photograph, I burst out laughing. He is the most important person on the planet in crypto. He starts Bitcoin magazine in 2011. In 2013, he says, I've got a better idea than the Bitcoin blockchain. He says, I'm going to build a blockchain, which kind of looks like the Bitcoin blockchain. It's got all that magic in, all that permissionlessness, and trustlessness, and immutability. But I'm not going to use it to run a currency specifically. I'm going to add a piece. I'm going to put a layer on the top of that blockchain. And it's going to be a programming language. And I'm going to hand this package, this blockchain plus a programming language, to the world. And I'm going to say, you people out there smarter than me, build something. See what you can dream up. Innovate. You've got a programming language. You've got a blockchain. Surely you can think of something. He called the programming language Solidity. Programs are called smart contracts, which you may have heard of. And it turned out to be an idea bigger than him, because from that moment on, there was a Cambrian explosion of innovation. There were innovations in finance. There were innovations in ownership, like NFTs, which I'll talk about in a moment. There are other innovations which I'm going to talk about. People came up from garages all the way to large institutions, used this programming language, and these creatures started appearing on a daily basis. Thousands and thousands of projects. Some of them have survived, some of them have made money, some of them have utility, some of them are doing important things, and some of them have been hacked, and some of them were scams, and some of them caused people to lose money. As I said, we're in an ocean with lots of creatures, lots of beautiful, beautiful creatures, and lots of mutants and deformed creatures. This is early in the evolutionary period. All of the stuff has at its core digital, secure ownership and the birth of what is called elastic ownership. You remember in slide 1, I talked about deeds of possession. So let me now talk about elastic ownership. The picture on the right-hand side of your screen, which is an NFT, which you may have seen in the newspaper. It's a Bored Ape, number 8837, I think, out of 10,000. It sold for 40 million rand. The picture on the right of this, left of your screen, is free, which points to the absurdity of this new thing called NFTs and what people respond to because it's sexy and it's sensational. There's this massive amount of money being spent on what is questionable art, and all this person did is he flipped it around the y-axis and he said, this one's mine, it's not the same as the other one. What the NFT is not the art, it's not the digital file, it's not the MP3, it's not the piece of video. The NFT is a receipt. Remember that the next time you read an article about NFTs, somebody owns a receipt for this Bored Ape, or for an MP3, or for a book. The NFT is a receipt, which, like all other blockchain things, is immutable, is owned by the person who has the private key, and more importantly, is elastic in its definition. Now, what do I mean by that? Previously, I talked about how ownership is ossified into these documents, a title deed, a car registration, a receipt. Because an NFT is a receipt of ownership, and because it's a computer program, it can say anything. For instance, an NFT can say, I own this today, my wife owns it tomorrow, and if it rains next Wednesday, ownership passes to my child for 17.5 minutes. You cannot do that with ownership today. It has expanded, not even expanded, it has utterly changed, metamorphosed the concept of ownership, because ownership is no longer ossified into a single constrained understanding. It is infinite because it is a program. So where do NFTs, what do they really mean? NFTs are property rights. They define who owns a property, and because they are property rights, and because they are infinite, you get an entirely new set of industries that will open up in the crypto space. Let me talk about that. By the way, that bullet point there, the blowout, that's what's happened in the NFT space now. Those tens and hundreds of millions that are being paid for stuff are not being paid anymore. It was a bubble that was due to burst, but I'd like you to keep in mind that what is underneath all of this is elastic ownership. It is really new. It is really important. Okay, the next big innovation for this programming language on Ethereum was called Defi, which is what my book is about. And with my remaining, I'm going to go until 10 to, if that's all right. There's a whole bunch of services that we know and love from our banks, from our insurance companies, from our stock exchanges. We know how they work. What these companies do, like a bank, is at the core of a bank is a lend and borrow. That's what they do. You lend them money and they give an interest rate, and they loan that money out to somebody else and take a higher interest rate, and the gap between those two interest rates is their profit. Exchanges allow you to buy and sell stocks and other things, and the person at the middle takes a commission. Insuring companies tell you to give them money every month and they insure your risk. You have no understanding how that stuff works. If you ask the insurance company to see the actuarial tables, they'll tell you to go away. If you ask the bank to show you the algorithms by which they calculate your deposit interest rates and your loan interest rates, they'll tell you to go away. If you ask the exchanges to please let me understand how you calculate those commissions, they'll tell you to go away. There is an imbalance of power between us as citizens and these centers of financial power. And what DeFi is all about is removing that center of power and having people exchange, insure, and lend and borrow from each other without anybody sitting in the center. Number one, extracting rent of us. Number two, treating us like they know everything and we don't. It is an incredibly powerful set of technologies which has had some awful things happen to it in the last few weeks, which we won't have time to get into today. Last point, El Salvador and Central African Republic, which Professor Matambura talked about, where this stuff is now showing itself to be not only useful, but incredibly cheap for citizens. You can walk into a equivalent of a Sparta shop in El Salvador. Actually, you don't have to go to the Sparta shop. You can remit money to your cousin or the other way from your cousin in Los Angeles to you at about 0.2% of the transaction. If you go to Western Union, you'll pay 15%. That's what this technology does for you. Those logos at the bottom are a bunch of the most famous DeFi initiatives. Moving on, self-owned communities. Digital autonomous organizations, a whole new application, a whole new creature in the sea, a whole new evolution, application of blockchain. That little picture up there, which says 27%, was the one that brought this to the public eye. There was a single and last copy of the American Constitution that came up for sale, that came up for auctions. And so a whole bunch of very rich collectors said, I want that copy of the Constitution. I'm going to frame it and put it on the wall of my mansion. And a bunch of people who didn't have that much money said, no. We're going to buy it. And they set up a blockchain-based organization called Constitution DAO. And they sold tokens to citizens like you and me to raise enough money to buy the American Constitution and keep it out of the hands of some collector who would put it on his wall. They raised $40 million in 1 week. If they had formed a company to do that, for any of you who've tried to form a company, it's not only South Africa, anywhere in the world, it takes weeks. You've got to get paperwork and memorandum of corporations and partnership agreements and shareholder agreements. DAOs can be set up instantaneously. They can collect money. They can have their own rules. And why this is so important is we don't even recognize that we're in business. We are forced into a structure of business. As I said, corporations or partnerships or limited liability companies. Why? That's a fiction. And there are enormous layers of administration and logistics to make that stuff happen. DAOs are another way of doing that, where you don't have to conform to any of that stuff. You say, this is what I want. I'm going out to citizens to raise my funds. This is what this organization is going to do. Bullet point number 3, purpose and profit-driven communities defined by a decentralized organization where everybody has interest because they have tokens in the company, crypto tokens. At the bottom over there are some of the famous ones. Uniswap is the biggest stock exchange in the world, the biggest exchange in the world. 1 trillion transactions so far. It is owned by nobody. It is owned by its token holders. Metaverse you've all heard about. Won't talk too much about it, but what a metaverse is of course, it's a virtual world where you can play, interact, buy, sell. The reason I have the Africa Rare logo, that's Africa's first metaverse. It is a digital immersion. It's been around for a long time, Second Life for those people who remember in the early 2000s. But the growth of computing power now gives you photorealistic landscapes, fast rendering. You get to touch things. You can wear Google glasses. And what NFTs, what elastic ownership gives you are the rights to own property within this metaverse. So what will happen is McDonald's, or better, Prada, buys a piece of land, has the NFT to prove it's Prada's, lists over their handbags for sale, and then you can go there and click on it and buy your handbag. This world is far from me. I'm not sure I'll ever spend much time there, but if you are 18 or 20 or even 30, this is where you are spending your time. And as you know, Facebook has changed the name to Meta to take advantage of this commercial opportunity. Underneath it all, property rights, ownership, blockchain. I keep coming back to that. I think this is the last big creature. We're just about to cross the border from Web 2 to Web 3. Most people don't even know there was a Web 1 or Web 2 or Web 3. As a short definition, Web 1, which you'll remember from the early 90s, was websites. You looked at stuff. Sometimes you could click on something because it was underlined in blue. It'll take you something else. Sometimes you could leave your name and address. It was a read technology. Web 2, which is Airbnb and Uber and TikTok and Facebook, is you can read what's on there and you can publish to the website. You can upload your cat video. You can upload the picture of your little cottage at the bottom of the garden if you want to rent an Airbnb. The problem with Web 2 is that what was supposed to be the internet, remember the quaint phrase, information must be free, which was what the original internet was supposed to be about. It became a council of autocrats called Facebook, TikTok, Amazon. These massive companies, Twitter, they own the internet. And Dr. Gavin Wood, who's a cryptographer, who was one of the original Ethereum guys with Vitalik Buterin, said this is not the way it's supposed to work, where 8 or 9 or 10 or 11 companies completely control this new industry. We're going to build a new Web 3 where you read and you write and the users own the internet. There are no centralized companies. Now, there are lovers of the scheme and haters of the scheme. That little picture at the bottom on the left, you'll see all the usual suspect: Pinterest, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. Those are the council of autocrats. On the right-hand side, you'll see Bitcoin and Litecoin and a bunch of others. Those are owned by nobody. And what Web 3 proponents are trying to do is build a new web in which there are no companies controlling it. Only the users control it. It is a big vision. There is a lot to be developed. It is a fine vision, but there are many people who say it's another way for the rich to get richer, the poor to get poorer, and the rest of us to be slaves. I don't know where I sit on this one. A lot of research to be done over here. I am got 3 or 4 minutes to finish. The big headwinds in our face are, the most important one is regulation. Who has the most to lose in this world where people get to own their own stuff? Central banks, commercial banks, some of the centers of power in media, record companies who have already started losing to the Spotifys, but now the Spotifys may lose to the Web3 people. Regulation is a chaotic land of total carnage right now, ranging from those people who will threaten to kill you if you use crypto all the way to El Salvador and the Central African Republic. By the way, side note, the president of the Central African Republic is a double PhD in mathematics. He understands the stuff. Most people just cast it off in the Western world saying, oh, just a small African country, who cares? This guy knows what he's doing. Misinformation, the most important misinformation around the internet is about energy usage. I have an article coming out in Daily Maverick next week, which will address the staggeringly bad reporting and misinformation around energy usage with Bitcoin and some of the other blockchains. Other headwinds, scams, grifters, hackers, the whole of North Korea, apparently, the whole of North Korea is funded by a very sophisticated hacking group, which is funded by the president. And the last one is complexity. The stuff is hard. They haven't sorted out the UI and the UX and the experience, and people are scared. And if I press this button, does it go away? And who do I call if I can't find my money? And is there a call? All of the stuff hasn't been sorted out. Complexity is a big barrier to that. But complexity, as we all know, is an engineering problem and a design problem and a social science problem. It is solvable. Finally, all sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. A quote from Arthur C. Clarke, famous science fiction writer. The question is, advanced technologies from radios to cars, to TV, to PC, to internet, to cell phones, were all magic once upon a time, and now they're not. They have embedded themselves in our life. We don't think twice about them. We use them. We appreciate them. That we certainly don't consider it magic. The blockchain right now is magic. And the question I leave you with today is, when do blockchains vanish into commodities? I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Professor Steven Sidley, for that fascinating presentation. You have made the case. You have made a solid case for the group. This is why we must do research in the area of blockchain. This is why we must do research in the area of the cryptoverse, the crypto space. It's a fascinating presentation, and we're going to have Professor Charis Halley, who's going to do a response to this lecture and also ask some probing questions to Steven. Professor Charis, the moment is yours. She's head of the IFK group, the data science across disciplines. She's also a professor in the Faculty of Engineering and the Built Environment at the University of Johannesburg. Professor Charis, the moment is yours.
Thank you very much, Prof. And thank you so much, Steven, for your presentation. I think it covered a lot and started probing into many different kinds of areas that I think are quite interesting. I think for me, the biggest question came around your notions around ownership. That idea of owning it, and how you were discussing that within the context of, for instance, money, we don't own our money. And how do we create a system where that is not the case anymore? And you're basically putting an argument forward for this kind of structure, which allows us to own our money. But I also wanted to ask you, actually just discuss with you the ideas of ownership, and then the link to that in terms of accountability. For instance, if you have a situation where, for instance, a car's ownership, or an insurance company, for instance, let's say that ownership is distributed. All right. So no single person basically, or organization is basically able to bear the brunt of any liability. Is there not a situation within the structure of blockchain where, in essence, what we're doing is actually creating a situation where ownership kind of starts to vanish to an extent in certain situations, and then actually removing the notion of accountability? So while it can allow you to maintain ownership, at the same time, is there a possibility for it to remove that, basically by distributing it too extensively?
Thank you. The best answer I can give you to that is a 4,000 word manifesto was written by a gentleman by the name of Moxie Marlinspike. Now, Moxie Marlinspike was the creator of the Signal messaging app. And when all the evangelism started happening around Web3, I suppose I'm one of them because you can see my hands flying around all the time. When all the evangelism started about Web3, he said, wait a minute, very much like you're asking. He says, some systems naturally tend towards centralization. It is not true that decentralization is the virtue of the universe. It is true, in my reading of the situation, that the decentralization that we've talked about across many axes, but they're all what you've talked about is things decentralized, including ownership, is at the losing end of the scale, there's not much of it, and there's far too much centralization. So on the matter of accountability, that is something that naturally tends towards centralization. And Marlinspike's his thesis is don't throw the baby out, essentially. Take centralization where it's important. I'll give you a beautiful example of centralization, by the way. The internet would not exist without the Defense Force in America. The internet was funded by DARPA. It was funded by the American government. It was a state centralized initiative. There were lots of them, GPS, cell phones, all of that. So centralization works. A crypto blockchain maximalist will say centralization results in an abuse of power. I don't believe that is always so. So I think what we're looking for here is a happy medium.
I agree with you. And I think that's probably for me, in all the discussion and all the hype and the excitement, there is a tendency to always go to the extreme and to say, well, let's completely decentralize. And I agree with you, because at the same time, there are components to centralization that have additional elements like that sense of support, that sense of comfort. So with a bank, there's a sense of comfort because there's certain service that you're provided with, certain support structures. If you don't understand how certain things work within your financial structure, you have that kind of support. Like you were saying with a blockchain setup, who do you phone if something goes wrong? Like, who do you turn to? Where centralized structures have that in hand already. So there's definitely, I agree with you. I think that's the balance. Is always just maintaining that. Actually, that leads me to another topic. In the context of blockchain, what do you think are the things we should be concerned about? Because there's always hype and people kind of latch on blindly. I know it's the same in data science and AI. People immediately believe it's going to solve all our problems. And so they latch on and start running with these technologies that they don't necessarily understand. Where do you see the pitfalls of a lack of understanding of the technology really having an impact on society?
Okay, so I talked about in one of the slides, the headwinds. Clearly, one of the things that we have to be careful about, you know, you would expect me to say crime and grifters and scams, of which there is, but the truth of the matter is the amount of crime committed on blockchains is a very, very, very small speck compared to the world of traditional crime and traditional finance. The real danger in blockchain, it's because it has suddenly become such a deep and complex subject, is that we never get to explain how wonderful it is to people, and they never get to use it. It is the user interface. It is the social science of it. It is why is it good for me as a citizen? I'll give you an example. It goes back to your last question. We talk about the centralization of banks. The banks have got call centers. There's somebody to call. They've done risk management. They do it very well. They don't lose your money. Banks don't lose your money. If you're a person with 200 Rand, that's all you got. That's all you've ever saved. Versus if you're a person with 200 million Rand. You both walk into the same bank and you both say, I'd like to open a checking deposit. Who gets their phone calls returned? Who gets the better interest rates? That centralization, the very fact of centralization, causes exclusion for those people who don't fit the center of the bell curve. So that's an answer to the question of, you know, decentralization has tipped over too far. Decentralization is going to widen the circle. The question of where are the pitfalls? Yeah, some crime. Number two, definitely complexity of use. And then there is regulation, which is the most complex. And the reason why regulation is the most complex is that in order for there to be a global acceptance of this technology, a global usage, a global spread, a take-up, a deployment, you need to have a harmonized set of rules for engagement, which we have in banks and we have in almost every industry. We have harmonized sets, we have standard documents, we've got international trade. And the difference between the regulatory regime right now in El Salvador versus the US versus Europe versus China versus South Africa is completely different. And regulation takes decades to harmonize, whereas the technology just moves forward at blind speed. So that's a danger too.
I agree. I think technology is often moving ahead of us when we're just struggling to catch up in so many different ways.
Yeah,
yes?
So sorry, I'm serious. This particular technology, I can't take a holiday. I can't even barely go to sleep at night because if I don't read my news feed the next day, I've fallen behind. It moves terrifyingly fast.
A lot of the technologies that have come out now, definitely, and many people are scrambling to keep up. And I think the lack of understanding of the technologies, lack of understanding of their impact, where they should be used, where they shouldn't be used, like you say, maintaining a balance. I think for me, that is often the scary thing, is just the fact that we literally need continual training in the different kinds of technologies as they come out in order to be able to utilize them intelligently. Actually, what you said previously, kind of in terms of the regulatory laws and structures, like you said, I mean, my main concern usually because of my field is in data and the kind of privacy laws and privacy issues around data. And one of the first things that I started thinking when I thought of blockchain is, but how can it live up to the privacy laws? How can it actually maintain those, like POPI Act and all of those? Is that possible? Is it necessary for that to be happening?
Yeah, so I mean, the privacy laws which you talk of obviously have wide application and different incarnations of what privacy is, but the blockchain is probably the best place to ensure privacy. The blockchain itself in most incarnations is public. So you can go in and look at the entire Bitcoin network and see who's transacting what. What you can't see is the human individual behind it. But there are other blockchains and other crypto tokens which are entirely private so that you can't even see what's happening over there. So the harness of blockchain technology gives you the possibility or the potential of implementing whatever privacy framework you can imagine. The whole of crypto, if you sort of funnel it down, at the bottom is the private key. It's the best place to be private. The private key is what determines your ownership because only you know that key.
Yeah. In terms of, I think one of the things that always comes up in most of our discussions and many of our webinars, being South Africans, is, I mean, the fourth industrial revolution has now come and we're all trying to kind of take advantage of the technologies and the methods and everything that's come with it. But there has been debates about the fact that the fourth industrial revolution has only impacted on a few. It's only had an impact on certain sectors of society, and other sections it's had absolutely no impact. It basically doesn't even feature. To what extent do you actually envision a technology like blockchain truly like taking the world by storm, and i.e. infiltrating different sectors of society in a way that I think the 4IR has not as yet, just because of the nature of our country, for instance?
Yeah, I can only give you one, the best answer I can give you is a real world example, which is El Salvador. In fact, I'll give you two examples. You'll remember when smartphones arrived in this country, and you know, the narrative among technologists is people in the real South Africa are never going to understand how to use a smartphone. Turned out to be nonsense. Everybody learned how to use a smartphone, even a low-cost smartphone. More importantly, in El Salvador, although it's a country with a smaller population than ours, I think there are 6 million people there, the education levels in El Salvador are very, very low. The majority of the population does not finish high school, and a big swath doesn't even finish primary school. And the same question arose: are they going to get this? Are they going to do a remittance with this cell phone and this crypto wallet? And I've got to understand keys. And when 60% of that population is now transacting daily on it. So I don't believe there is a barrier.
Thank you. I think the other thing that I was actually curious about, because one of the things is that seems to be an amazing benefit is the fact that obviously this kind of technology allows for immutability. So once the data is in there, it's in there and it can't be changed. isn't there potential then for obviously misinformation being spread, or isn't that opening up the system to basically a negative influence through just basically false data infiltrating the system? Or do you think that there's absolutely no chance of anything like that occurring?
Oh, that's a hard question, Professor. Oh, you're killing me here. The immutability, of course, is one of the advertised benefits of the blockchain. In fact, somebody had a very nice way of expressing it. Blockchain gives you computers that can commit, and they can't uncommit. And you're making the case that it is a scenario that one could contemplate in which misinformation gets inbred into the system and can't be unraveled. You have me stuck, Professor. I don't have a good answer for you.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there is an answer, but I actually just thought maybe we could get an answer from our audience if they could envision. For me, any advantage to a technology, I mean, as you can imagine, you start thinking to yourself, but how can that be utilized against that specific technology? So any of the benefits that crypto has, just like the benefits of a bank, at the same time, that centralized benefits that you obtain, that's also part of the problem of a centralized entity. And I'm thinking to myself at the same time, like the notion of ownership, does that lead to a lack of accountability all of a sudden if ownership can be distributed amongst many, for instance? Like, who do you point the finger at? Like, it's nice to be able to point the finger at the bank and say, well, they messed up. But if there's no one person, if there are too many, how do you do that? In the same token, exactly this, how does that immutable structure actually work against the system itself? So it was actually just kind of just wondering.
It's a nice point, and I just want to prod it a little bit more with you, Professor. I'm going to take an example of two news outlets, left-wing, reasonably left-wing outlet like the New York Times, and a reasonably right-wing thing like Fox News, okay? You have two different board of editors there. Board of editors, the New York Times says, we're going to print this stuff because we believe it is true. And on the other side of the coast of Fox News in Los Angeles, I think it's in Los Angeles, you've got another board of editors who print a diametrically opposed narrative because they believe it's true. And so the board of editors, one of them believes that something else is misinformation, which the other one believes is true. However, if you had a situation where there was a media outlet in which there were 20 million editors, would we not have a better chance of getting the truth into the system?
Actually, that's exactly what I was thinking, is to what extent does that allow for the transparency that you would want, to allow for deeper engagement? But at the same time, a part of me is wondering, to what extent does that allow for mob rule, where basically the majority rules? And sometimes we know the majority isn't right. I think one of the scary things for me during when the COVID pandemic hit was that a lot of the information that was going out was not being given out by people that were experts in the field of either diseases or using machine learning to be able to predict. And so there was a lot of misinformation being spread by the majority because the minority that were in fact experts were not necessarily the first ones to speak up. And so it's that kind of like push and pull that I'm starting to wonder at, to what extent are you setting up a system that ideally, like which is one of the things I loved about what you were presenting, supports the individual, that individual ownership, retaining ownership, and at the same time is potentially setting up a system with now you could have a majority rule actually put in place at the same time.
As we skate onto the thinnest of ICO, Professor, which is basically saying, is democracy the right system?
That's a good question. And
I would social science, the social scientists in the audience who are looking for a PhD thesis, this is a fabulous one.
Yeah, guys, if you can solve this for us, we'd happily help you get a PhD.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. Let's get to the audience now. Langton, Divine, and Surprise in that order. Langton, are you ready to ask your question? Please be very brief. Either a statement or a question, but very brief. Langton, are you ready?
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Yeah, probably my question was answered through the sessions and through the chat, but I wanted to find out from Prof. Sidley how blockchain can be of value to the African problem, because mostly we see that the African problem, the African economy is agro-based. Is there a chance that, you know, blockchain can play a vitally crucial role in agriculture?
Yeah.
I'm ready. I'm going to go ahead and just contribute a small section to the origination of Bitcoin as of 2007. I've noticed that many African individuals have been innovative and creative. We have Professor Mtambara here, is well known for innovating major GPS strategies at NASA. And we have seen the evolution of Uber and Lyft having originated in Zimbabwe, but we have seen very little accolades be attributed to the creative ideas of Africa. And not to beat my chest, but I wanted to also propose the idea that my paperwork in 2007 actually mentions the word Bitcoin and the creation of immutability, double spending, and all those other things. And I'd hired developers in 2007, which of course we know Bitcoin came up in 2009. And so I just wanted to give the panel that, you know, we have these ideas that started in Zimbabwe due to inflation, suffering, and banks being run down. And these things cause us to be very, very creative to see how can we solve problems for Africa? How can we develop our own country so that people don't lose their resources to political misfits or mismanagement of the economy? And even now, it is my greatest ambition to push for the recognition of African ingenuity into the technology sector, as well as making sure that Africans can at least embrace these assets early on, so that they are not always second class and second fiddle. So that's just what I wanted to comment. And definitely I would like to collaborate in the future with anybody who would like to see my work. I'm here in the United States, and I'm very ambitious to share this information so that it's out there, that there are people who have been thinking about it, that took these steps. And if this is one of the greatest technologies that is now existing, then I'm very comfortable that we should claim it as ours, if Satoshi doesn't come out to explain who he is. And thank you.
Thank you very much. Be very brief, Surprise, and then I'll go back to Professor Steven to respond. Surprise, are you ready, Surprise?
Thank you very much. My question is based on the operations of the Bitcoin or the blockchain. I wanted to ask, since like the professor said the Bitcoin does not belong to any company, right? So is it possible that maybe if I hold some Bitcoin, then I want to sell them, I find like no one interested for some reasons? So like, as we know with equities, the company that issued the shares, they're obliged to buy back if I'm selling. So since like nobody owns Bitcoin, no company behind, like, is it possible that if I sell, no one be interested for some reason to buy? Maybe, for example, let's take it is not profitable at the moment. And my second question is that I wanted to ask how volatile are Bitcoin compared to equities? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I get back to Professor Sidley, Tapiwa, Tebogo, and Divine, be ready to come through after the intervention from the professor. Tapiwa, Tebogo, and Divine. Professor Sidley, could you respond to those three issues raised?
Sure. I'm sorry, in my rush to get ready for this, I didn't bring a pen with me, so I'm going to forget everybody's name. The first questioner's name was Langton, is that correct?
Langton, yes, Langton, Divine, and Surprise.
Yeah, thank you, Langton, for your question about agriculture. You know, just off the top of my head, I can think of already 3 applications for agriculture. If I was steeped in agriculture, there are probably hundreds of blockchain applications. The 3 most obvious ones are within finance, farmers within Africa have difficulty accessing finance for all the reasons I've talked about, that banks are fairly centralized and don't pay a lot of attention to people who have small capital needs. And decentralized finance, which my book is about, is exactly outlines a solution blockchain to this problem, where you can have small amounts, you can have people without any documentation, all trading and operating within the same financial system as is currently restricted by the big banks. So finance would be one area, and microloans, particularly small farmers. The second one is, as we know, within Africa, we have some countries which suffer from fairly endemic corruption in tenders, and the lodging of tenders onto the blockchain would go a long way to protecting against some of the corruption that we've seen, particularly those of you who've been following, for instance, the Zondo report. The third area is in the certainty of pricing, which is done by a blockchain approximate technology called oracles. One of the issues in farming in Africa is the difficulty of understanding and harmonizing prices between markets, producers, and consumers. And there have been non-blockchain attempts. The blockchain makes it very easy to ensure that those prices are believable and trustworthy. Those are only three that come off the top of my head. Secondly, Divine, I just need to say to you, if you were talking about Bitcoin and double spend in 2017, you are an original gangster, and I'm very impressed. I have not met anybody yet in my journey. Yeah, I have not met anybody in my journey through this who was doing anything in 2007. All of those people are just names in books to me. So I'm very, very pleased to meet you, and who knows, maybe we can swing the conversation back to African innovation in this space through the hard work that's been done by Professor Mutambara and his institute. That's a great story. I'm so happy to hear that. And the last question was surprise. I'm sorry, surprise. There were two questions. The one had to do with volatility. The one had to do with who do you sell your Bitcoin to? That certainly is not a problem. Bitcoin is one of the most liquid markets in the entire world. There's more daily trades on Bitcoin than there is in Ford and General Motors and Amazon and the big stocks. It is highly liquid. There are lots of exchanges. You will be able to do a sale on one of the exchanges like Luno in a fraction of a second at any time during 24 hours. The second question had to do with the volatility of Bitcoin. The volatility of Bitcoin is way in excess of the volatility of stocks, although everybody has sunk into a terrible bear market because of the Russian war and inflation, et cetera, et cetera. That volatility, you must remember, is the industry is less than 13 years old. It is still growing up, it's stumbling, it's falling over, bad things are happening, there's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of greed. I expect that volatility will go on, but not giving any financial advice here from my perspective. And my commitment is that the Bitcoin price is long-term, zoom back, that price is going up for a very long time. If you can deal with the stomach-wrenching horror of a 15% drop in one day. Thank you.
Excellent, Professor. Now Tapiwa, Tebogo, and David. Not Divine, but David. Tapiwa, are you ready, Tapiwa?
Thank you, Professor Tamara. Thank you, Professor Sidley and Professor Hardy. I think this is directed to both of you. The cryptoverse and blockchain technology, I know it might be more into a bit of social sciences. Is it leading to a new internationalization of money or value? I'm thinking here of issues around if network connectivity across the globe is increasing at the same rate.
Thanks a lot. David, are you ready, David?
Yeah, thanks a lot for this. I just wanted to say to Professor Sidley, like, I think what they were talking about, saying if they want someone to do a PhD, it's basically an oracle problem, whereby I think you're taking data from outside the world and putting it into the blockchain. And there are a few blockchains that are actually trying to do this, with Chainlink being one of them. So there are already solutions. And also I wanted to take the opportunity to say, this is a space I'm also involved in. I actually did a presentation to the Zimbabwe Economic Society about this. So I would love to be your PhD student under your supervision. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Professor, can you take those 2 questions, Professor Sidley?
Good. I'm glad we're restricting it to 2 because without my pencil, my memory is
Okay.
first question, the internationalization of money. Yes, there are two questions embedded in there. The first question is it a desired goal to have a single form of money? I don't think it is. I think that there will always be different kinds of money or different kinds of representations of wealth. For instance, one representation of wealth, which we don't talk about very often, is oil. Oil is probably the most stable representation of wealth there is. There's the dollar and all the other currencies. They're not going away. You know, America's not going to collapse, and Europe's not going to collapse, and South Africa's not going to collapse. There will always be nation states. They will always have their own currencies. But what we are seeing is the rise of a parallel currency, which will be internationalized, because that is the nature of the blockchain. It belongs, it sits, it resides, and it works on individuals' computers around the world without care for their nationality. So it is an international monetary system, as will some of the others like Ethereum be. On the next question of, so the first one, is it desirable for there to be an international monetary system? Yeah, perhaps. But is it desirable for there to be 2 or 3 or 5 or 7 stable systems? I think more so. This is a question for monetarists and economics more than it is for me, but it will certainly internationalize. On the comment that was made secondarily about the oracles and Chainlink, I'm very happy to hear that you've done some work on that, and just I want to explain what the problem is to the audience of stuff coming in from the outside to the blockchain. There are blockchain applications. Consider a blockchain application for insurance. And somebody asks this blockchain-based insurance application to pay out because they have hail damage. So when was the hail damage? Well, the hail damage was 3 days ago. There was a big hailstorm and my windscreen got broken. How does the blockchain smart contract know that there was a hailstorm 3 days ago and that the guy is not lying? The only way to do that is to find a weather source outside of the blockchain and find out if it hailed in this area 3 days ago. But that's not good enough because the whole of blockchain is based on decentralization. So what Chainlink has done is they are a provider of external sources of information, prices, weather reports, et cetera, but they never, ever choose one source only. They choose many sources of that information and they aggregate it, and that is their decentralization to ensure that the data coming into the blockchain is true.
Okay, before I get to Natman and Edzai, Professor Charis, can you give us your parting shot? I know you're going to step out. Professor, can you say a few words, Professor?
Sorry, I actually have another meeting and I've also got load shedding. So
you can see you come back.
So yes, I've come back in part. Actually, I just want to say thank you very much to the audience tonight. I think the kinds of questions that are being asked are extremely interesting, but also extremely relevant, especially for South Africans. So, and actually a lot of the answers that Steve has given, especially the one around internationalization of money and possibly having a few, I think that kind of few stable entities, I think that again speaks to the notion of decentralization and how it actually can provide a more stable structure. And when you were speaking actually now about the outside sources of information going into the system, immediately I was again wondering to what extent the system can then be utilized as a means of spreading misinformation if those sources are all working in conjunction. So if you have multiple bad people, so to say, with a specific purpose in mind. So it's just so many interesting discussions coming up. And I just want to thank you all that I was a part of it. So yeah, keep on asking questions. I think Prof. Sidley will be here for quite some time still.
Thank you.
Thanks, Professor. Natman, are you ready? Edzai, be ready. Natman first, then Edzai. Natman.
Good evening, Professor.
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Thank you. My question is that We have been in COVID that has been troubling Africa, and at that same time, people were looking for solutions to transact, to do business openly. So my question is, do you think we can still rely with corporate governance as a vehicle to allow the invention or adoption of corporate governance in Africa, considering that we've got a corporate governance structure that is failed in an administration that was centralized, and this time around we are talking about blockchain, which comes with the fastest such like okay, which allows decentralization. So do you think we can still rely with corporate governance going forward as a means to help? Because if there's corporate governance, we expect that the leaders, if leaders accept that the idea of corporate governance is helpful, they can also facilitate or speed up their it's what can I say?
Yeah, try to be very specific and to the point.
Okay, so do you think, how can we use corporate governance so that we adopt the blockchain technology, considering that it has failed, especially in Africa? Yeah, something like that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Natman. Edzai Zobo.
Thank you, Professor. Very interesting conversation. So from my side, I mean, just looking at the history of the internet, when it was started, it was supposed to liberalize and democratize access to information, dissemination, and also economics. But that wasn't the case because a few data oligarchs took over your Facebooks, Amazons, and other big corporates. But now we have a situation now where it seems the hippies of the West Coast in America, or you know, the libertarians, are now saying, let us change the economic order. And there seems now to be a case where the Creative Commons that was there when the internet started, it has now found an economic value. So it's almost like philosophy meets economics. And what does that mean in terms of the world order? And how are the big corporates taking this platonic change? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. These are two interventions.
Okay. Let me start with, and I believe the first questioner's name was Natman. There is if you will remember the slide, and I'm happy to, by the way, Professor Mutambara, to make these slides available. If you remember the slide about decentralized autonomous organizations, that is the answer to your question. A decentralized organization has governance built into the smart contract. So what you have in a decentralized autonomous organization is you have a bunch of token holders, which are more or less equivalent to shareholders, or in fact, more or less equivalent to shareholders and board of director members. So you'll have 5,000 of these people who hold a token in a particular DAO. And in the smart contracts is built in the governance of that DAO. And what that does is it completely avoids the sort of things that we see in corporate governance all over, not only in Africa, but all over the world, where governance fails. And when governance fails, you get corruption and fraud and mismanagement and neglect of money, et cetera, et cetera. Corporate governance failure is probably one of the biggest reasons for economic collapse within companies, because people don't stick to the rules, and they don't stick to the rules because human beings are not always trustworthy. If that governance is written into a smart contract, particularly through DAO, where you have thousands of people, thousands of eyes looking at the governance, you have a situation where there's less chance of governance mismanagement. On to the second question about the oligarchies. Once again, you are correct. We have what I called the march of the autocrats. the Council of Autocrats, where you have these massive companies that have become almost too big to fail, who have captured, there's no other word for it, who have captured the majority of the internet. You know, you only have one search engine. I mean, you've got Bing on Microsoft, but if you want to use mail, you've got to use Gmail. You have very little competition. And Charles Hodgkinson, who was the guy who invented Web3, this is a reaction against it. This isn't a push to reinvent what the internet is and to get it back to something which is democratic. Now, I talked about Moxie Marlinspike's paper, and if you look in the Daily Maverick next week, I actually have the link to his paper, which is about, yeah, we've got to decentralize some stuff, but other stuff needs to remain centralized. There's also a second link in that article that's coming out in Daily Maverick, which is a website called howsweb3going.com. I think it's called howsweb3going.com, which is a warning that the democratic pixie vision that we see in front of our faces of a future internet, which is owned by its users, and there's no council of autocrats and there's no large companies, is not achievable. This is an unfolding story. I think the truth will lie somewhere between the oligarchy, which we are now slaves of. I don't mean that in a bad way. You know, I like my Google search and I like my Gmail. I mean, we have very little alternatives. And a world where there is pure libertarianism, which brings with it its own dangers. And I think somewhere in the middle of that, we'll see a greater spread of a democratic internet. I can only hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Molly, be ready, Molly. While Molly is very ready, Professor, yesterday we did a big debate on jobs. So blockchain, Cryptoverse, does that mean more jobs or less jobs? What does it mean to the future of work? Secondly, the issue of Web3. What are the implications to the big debate around data sovereignty, where people are saying, who owns the data? Right now, it's a few high-tech companies in California that owns the data. So Web3 will address the issue of data sovereignty in what way? So the future of jobs and also the matter of data sovereignty, Professor.
Okay, the matter of jobs is like everywhere else. The growth in jobs is, if you want to prepare yourself for the future, you've got to know the digital world, which is what UJ is all about, as we know, and particularly IFK. The future of jobs is not going to be in manual labor. So there's going to be, what's the best word that I can say? There's going to be an upset in the way that the future of work operates, jobs. And we saw last night, Professor Mutambara, your MIT guest, how many jobs will disappear, the new ones which will arrive. I think blockchain just sits square in the middle of all the new digital technologies, and there will be many jobs created, but they will be for a certain type of skill set. And it's my great pleasure to be working at a university where this is the major emphasis. It's not going to take away any jobs particularly from other digitization. It's a new, I'll give you an example. The supply-demand imbalance, Professor Mutambara, for blockchain programmers who know a language called Solidity, is so large right now that there are first-year students coming out of university and getting paid 5 million rand a year. So there's a great demand for people who understand this stuff right now. It will level out, but it is enormous. So there's a great deal of jobs available within the blockchain, but obviously you've got to be skilled enough to be able to do that. On your second question, is the vision of Web3 is that the data is owned by you. That's an easy one to do. They've already done it. They're called NFTs. The technology has been built. Can you imagine if you said to Facebook, right, I own all my data, I own all my posts, I own all my cat videos, I own everything about me, I own the data, the metadata about how I traverse the internet. I am prepared to share that with you if you give me half the revenue you get from your advertisers. That's the future of owning your own data. You get to monetize yourself.
Thank you very much, Molly. Are you ready, Molly? You can fire away, Molly.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you, Professor, for giving me this chance just to ask a question. Yesterday, I was at a fintech meeting in Manchester, here in the United Kingdom, and there was Barry James from East London University. The main thing that he was talking about was stable coins. Like right now, we have got the US dollar coin that was initiated by SECO in America. And then we have a euro dollar, which is coming up at the end of this month. That was done again by SECO in America. So, which means, in other words, which means the Americans are taking over all this. They are leading, actually. So what's going to happen with Africa? Do we have something in the pipeline for our own stable dollar, or are we waiting for someone from the outside to create one for us? Because right at the moment, I assume that our banks do not have the technology to do any stable coins at the moment.
Thank you, Molly. I have good news for you, and I declare upfront a conflict of interest because I'm a shareholder in the company. It's called ZARP, Z-A-R-P. It's a South African stable coin. It's pegged to the rand. It was built locally in Cape Town by some blockchain programmers. It's I'm under non-disclosures. I can't talk much about it. It's being backed by a massive financial institution. I believe there's some other stablecoin efforts, but this is the big one. The banks are not going to touch anything around this until the regulations are clear in South Africa. And the South African Reserve Bank, contrary to what most people may expect, really does have their arms around this technology. They are treading very cautiously, and they're listening very clearly to what people are saying, and they're looking very carefully at what's happening in the United States. But with absolute certainty, we will have a rand stable coin. In fact, if you go to OVEX today, OVEX.com, I think it is, it's a South African website, it's an exchange. You can buy ZARP, you can buy a South African stable coin. It's already running, existed, it's been hardened, it's been debugged, it's a real thing.
Right, okay. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Molly. Professor, can you give us your parting shots before we go to our closer? What are your parting shots on this fascinating subject, Professor?
Yeah, my parting shots are that this has been the largest and fastest movement of human wealth in history from one asset to another in 13 years at 1.3 trillion, now a little over $1 trillion. This is something very important. The money didn't move there by accident. The innovations that came out of Ethereum and the Solidity programming language and DeFi and NFTs and Web3 and Metaverse and GameFi didn't happen by accident. You said earlier in your opening remarks, Professor Mutambara, that this is going to seep into every area of our lives. I agree. I think it's appropriate that this is now part of a serious research effort at the university. I urge everybody here to ignore the headlines that are written by journalists who don't understand the stuff very deeply and start digging in deeper through IFK and some of the university initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, very much, Professor. So here we are, we have launched our group. So we're open to have master's students, PhD students, postdocs, and researchers to work in the field of blockchain and the cryptoverse. Now we're going to our closer, Professor Namdi Mulu, who is director of the Center for Cyber Physical Food, Energy and Water Systems. He's also a professor of electrical engineering in the Department of Electrical and Electronic Engineering Science at the University of Johannesburg. Professor Mulu, can you give us your closing remarks?
Thank you very much, Professor Mutambara. I'm experiencing load shedding here, so my lighting is very bad, but I would try to make the best out of the situation. All right, thank you, Prof. Mutambara and the IFK for facilitating such a fascinating conversation. And then thank you to Professor Sidley for a very insightful presentation. I'd like to just give a wrap up about what happened. Prof. Sidley basically introduced his research group, which is the Blockchain and the Cryptoverse Research Group, whose aim is to conduct cutting-edge research in the blockchain space. And then he delved into his presentation, which basically, talked about the origins of blockchain from the cryptography space up until very recent developments like NFTs and DAOs and the rest. Fascinating because further lots of work is ongoing. He mentioned now that he has to keep pace with all the developments in this space. We hear about Web 5.0, Web 5, the fusion of Web 2 and Web 3, which is the sensory and emotive web, which is actually built up on Web 3, and lots of fascinating discussions in this space. Prof. Sidley's presentation touched on many aspects, including the concept of elastic ownership, which is one of the key areas that he harped on, right? And then lots of other nuggets were also passed in the conversation. And then I think a takeaway that I could get, even based on the interactions with Prof. Hadi, is that there needs to be a balance, right, between decentralization. Sometimes centralization can oftentimes be necessary in certain cases. All right, and what that speaks to is we have to, as researchers in the blockchain domain, as academics, we have to come up with a framework whereby we can properly map out areas or methods of properly deploying the blockchain technology, right? It's not enough to just do what is called a technology transplant and just basically deploy it in our various cases or applications. One needs to understand it. One needs to move above the hype and then understand how and when it can be tweaked to the various applications, especially in the African context. And that's one of the things that came up a lot, especially from the folks that ask questions: how can it be deployed in the African context? How can it be deployed in sub-Saharan Africa, essentially? And I think Prof. Sidley mentioned now that there is hope. He gave the example of El Salvador, right? And how even after they have deployed Bitcoin as their legal tender, I think he said 60% of the populace are actually leveraging on the technology. And then for me, my personal takeaway or my personal interest would be how can we harness this technology as it were in the bid to actualize the SDGs, because Africa is we're in the last decade for the actualization of the SDGs. And then if technology can help us in a way as an accelerator towards achieving SDGs, then I feel now that blockchain is a prime candidate that can serve as an SDG accelerator. And there are a lot of instances, a lot of works that are ongoing amongst other players in the university in this space, basically considering how blockchain amidst other FIR technologies can serve as SDG accelerators. And then one obvious example I can point to is the area of governance, as Prof. Sidley mentioned in his, I think in his almost near closing the remarks, right? Lots of governance issues are at the heart of some of the unsustainable practices that we have. If you have DAOs, if you have smart contracts that beams the light and removes issues of opaqueness, right? Then there might be improved governance models such that we can further achieve some of these SDGs, right? And another option is also to leverage on tokens in a bid to tokenize good behavior, right? Such that because most of the SDGs basically are geared towards certain social outcomes, right? But when other resources are used properly, for instance, SDG 2 that speaks to food, SDG 6 that speaks to energy, 6 that speaks to water, 7 that speaks to energy, and the rest, if the blockchain can be leveraged to tokenize various players in this space such that they are able to take the right decisions, mitigate harmful emissions, mitigate water pollution and the rest, it can also be an accelerator towards achieving our SDGs. And there are a lot of other examples that that one can give, but time is of the essence. So in closing, I would like to reiterate what Professor Mutambara and Prof. Sidley have said. The aim of some of these discussions is not just to discuss for the sake of discussions, but basically to cause us to put our nose to the grindstone, and then also serve as an advertisement for research students, for masters, for PhDs, for postdocs to join the university in the bid to tackle these problems and fashion out homemade African solutions to the problems bedeviled in Africa. That's all from me. Thank you, everyone. Prof. Mutambara, over to you, please.
Thank you so very much, Professor Ngulu, for those detailed remarks. And as I close, I must emphasize that we seek to improve the quality of life of the Africans. All these technologies, all this knowledge must be used to improve the material conditions of the Africans and of the entirety of humanity. All our seminars and public lectures are recorded. You can find them on our website and other various personal websites that we have. We want to make sure the struggle and the pursuit for the future of knowledge continues. And with those words, I must say, we've come to the end of this session. Thank you so very much, everyone.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.